Hello everyone, my name is Wendy Lawson and I'm the Senior Director for Member Services and Technology at IACCM. Thank you for joining us today for the IACCM Ask the Expert webinar entitled IACCMs Most Negotiated Terms 2018, a horror story. On behalf of IACCM and its members, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our expert today, Keld Jensen. Keld is an internationally recognized expert and advisor on negotiation, trust, and behavioral economics. He works with governments and major corporations in applying the techniques of the award-winning Smartnership negotiation strategy while maintaining a busy teaching schedule at top-ranked universities around the world. Welcome, Keld. We look forward to hearing what you're presenting on this subject today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Wendy. I'm looking forward to this because this topic is very close to my heart. I kind of live and breathe for the concept of negotiation, and obviously I've been following the most negotiated terms from IACCM for years. And obviously I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that I find it kind of a horror story, because it's kind of a continued horror stories, because it's more or less the same negotiated terms that we've seen over and over again. It's very little it's actually changed. And the reason I find it a horror story is basically because the listing and the priority of those items that are most negotiated are just really, really wrong. And that is based on the concept of utilizing value. And that is basically what I'm going to share within the next 45 minutes to an hour. And as you pointed out, Wendy, I'm very happy to receive questions and comments. And hopefully I might be provoking some people just a tiny bit, so they might counter argue and discuss this topic with me. And I'll be very open doing that. Now, what I feel obviously is that the concept of negotiation is really important. And the reason I'm saying that is because we constantly negotiate, and we negotiate more than we actually think. And in my work, I sometimes encounter people who are not really negotiators, but actually sit in enormous amount of negotiation. And I would call them to be a little bit rude bureaucrats instead, but they're just handling papers, a spreadsheet or whatever. So the second they have to move from that typical office position, sitting in front of a spreadsheet and just preparing a tender, whatever they're trying to do, the second they have to move from that position into negotiation, they get really scared because it's uncomfortable for them. So my purpose in life is really to improve the negotiation of tomorrow. And that obviously, as this slide is saying, means changing the mindset. And what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do today is actually changing a mindset. I am obviously lecturing, talking, speaking, advising on negotiation, but negotiation to me is so much more than just a toolbox. It's really how we are set up in collaborating. So it's all about how to collaborate and collaborate smarter. I won't make it boring and with a long introduction of myself. Wendy said a lot already. Very, very briefly, I'm a dad, and you do a lot of negotiation just by being a dad, and you can actually see how many of the most negotiated terms you can use in negotiation with your kids. Not a lot of them would actually work there, and that's even though you negotiate a lot with your kids. I've published a number of books globally on the topic, obviously, of negotiation and the generation of better collaboration. I'm doing a lot of speaking. I am an associate professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University in the US and lecturing at different universities around the world. And I have the pleasure, actually, of being able to use research resources at these universities to focus on how can we develop and utilize better results based on our negotiations. Now, the concept I'm going to talk about today, as Wendy said, has been acknowledged by several organizations. And one of them, I'm proud to say, is obviously IACCM, that honored the concept with the Innovation Award back in 2017. And we received a number of other awards about the concept. And I don't actually think we received the awards because the concept is brilliant, because it's actually very, very simple. I think we received them because we're trying to change the way we can negotiate, as I've been saying a couple of times already. Tiny bit of advertising here. This is my latest book, Honest Negotiation, that is basically having a lot of the content I'm going to talk about today. Now, let me just start off with World Economic Forum. They did a survey early 2018 where they actually came up with this conclusion that negotiation is the 5th most important skills, regardless what kind of work you might be in. And even me, living and breathing negotiation, was completely shocked and surprised about that they would put negotiation in their top 5. Now, whether they're right or wrong is really not important right now, but it just gives you and me an idea that negotiation is so much more than just a negotiation happening at the conference room when we're signing the contract. It's actually a living, breathing organism that lives from the second that one side reach out to another and way into the actual project. That means far after the contract has been signed. So we need to understand that negotiation is actually a kind of a strategy. It's something that we need to focus on that lives for a long time. I am basically spending my time traveling the world, trying to share this knowledge about 4 things that might change the world. And I know that's a big headline. But what I'm basically saying is there are 4 things that are crucial for us to be successful in any kind of negotiation. And one of them is the choice of a strategy. That basically means that you need to pick a strategy on how you want to negotiate. And obviously, I'm not the expert telling you what is the right or the wrong strategy, but we need a strategy. So a negotiation strategy is just as important as if we have a marketing strategy, communication strategy, go-to-market strategy, research and development strategy. Sorry, we need to have a negotiation strategy. The second item you see on the screen right now is trust. And the reason I got trust up here is because some years ago, I suddenly got a gut feeling that trust has dropped in the world. So I felt that you and I has less trust to each other, and the world in general has less trust than, let's say, 20 years ago. I got that feeling so strongly, so I wanted to write a book about it, but obviously you just can't write a book on your gut feeling. So I teamed up with the same organization as we saw before, World Economic Forum, and they went out and did a study among 20,000 people in 15 countries and came back and said, do you know what, Mr. Jensen? Unfortunately, you're right. Trust has dropped in the world with more than 55%. Now, I have changed the word trust into another word called trust currency. And the reason I've done that is because trust is equal to financial success. And listen very carefully, everybody. If you have a high level of trust in any kind of collaboration, your transactional cost will drop and your profit will go up, right? The same thing goes just quite opposite. If you have a low level of trust in a collaboration, your transactional cost will go up and your profit will go down. The third one, rules of the game, is all about that we need to negotiate on how to negotiate. And here we go with the first one that really has an impact on most negotiated terms. Because what I see quite often is that we just negotiate basically because we're a bit blind. We just negotiate these items that are on the top of the list because we've always done that. And that is what the legal department tells us to do, and that is what the attorneys tells us to do. But we haven't actually sat down, discussed what we want to negotiate or how we want to negotiate with the counterpart. So I know for some of you it sounds a bit crazy, but before we actually embark onto a negotiation with the counterpart, we have to negotiate on how to negotiate. And the fourth and final one is basically the concept of added value that I call necroeconomics. And I'll share that with you very briefly throughout this webinar, because this is one of the important one back to most negotiated terms, because the majority of the most negotiated terms that we have on the top 20 are not utilizing the fourth one here. And the fourth one, again, is not rocket science. It's basically utilizing the asymmetric values between two parties, but I'll explain that more into details in a few minutes from now. Now, when we are looking at this slide right here, what you see when we talk about, or when I talk to most clients, I'm usually showing them this slide and saying, would you like openness, honesty, respect, and confidence in your relationship with your counterpart? And basically everybody says yes. If you look at the bottom of this slide, it says knowledge, creativity, generosity, and authority. And I'm asking them the same questions. Would you like that in your collaboration with a counterpart? And once again, basically everybody says yes. Well, if we have openness, honesty, respect, and confidence, that will lead into a positive, progressive attitude that will lead into an improved personal chemistry. And our knowledge, creativity, generosity, and authority will lead into the ability to negotiate and communicate. This will give an improved personal chemistry and improve increased understanding, and will lead to a better cooperation. Now, look what happens when I'm changing the slide, because when we move and look what is happening if we have an improved cooperation, that means that we have problem solving instead of combat. We have creation, we're creating added value, and that will give us increased possibility, and will give us all an increased understanding. And that will obviously lead to that we reduce cost, reduce liabilities, and increase profit. Once again, and I'm getting back to why I feel this way, the most negotiated terms are not utilizing the content of these two slides because they're not looking into the value generating between the two parties. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what is really interesting to me is that regardless whether I'm sitting in Tokyo, in San Francisco, in Hong Kong, in Oslo, in Stockholm, in London, wherever it might be, and asking my audience about the content of these two slides, you know what's really funny? Regardless of whether they're sitting in procurement or sales or project or management or whatever, 100% of my audience agree to the content of these two slides. They're always saying it's exactly what we want. We want problem solving instead of combat. We want to create added value and increase possibilities. We want to understand the counterpart better. We want to have better personal chemistry. We want to reduce cost, reduce liabilities, and improve profit. And then they leave the meeting and go out and do something else. And this is basically why the most negotiated terms is a horror story to me, because we want something differently, but we do it the wrong way. This is actually kind of interesting. Look at the soldiers here. This is how most people negotiate today. Whether they want it or not, that's the way they negotiate. We're sitting there in our trench and we point the rifle towards the counterpart, and we win at the expense of the counterpart. That is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, called the zero-sum game. So we win at the expense of the counterpart. If I want to make an additional $100, the counterpart have to pay for that. If the counterpart is going to win $100, I'm going to pay for that. So we can only be successful if the counterpart is failing. Back to the most negotiated terms. The majority of those negotiated terms are zero-sum based. That means you can only be successful if the counterpart is winning. Listen for a second, ladies and gentlemen. Do you think that's going to make an easy negotiation? Do you think you'll be having a successful approach in a negotiation if you step in asking for something that will increase risk, liabilities, and cost to the counterpart? If you step into a negotiation and ask your counterpart, I would like to make $100 extra, I can almost promise you your counterpart is not going to say, well, that's absolutely fair. Obviously, you should make an additional $100 and we should pay for it. So here you go. I just gave you $100 right now. Obviously, they're not going to do that. They're going to fight. They're going to argue. That there's going to be a lot of combative behavior in order to prevent that cost and liability to them. So we need to change that mindset. Now, when we look at the most negotiated terms 2018, it could basically have said 2017, 2016, 2015. There's a tiny bit of changes to that list, but it is really tiny. So when I compare these lists throughout the years, I have to look very careful to see the changes, because what could happen is that one of the most negotiated terms could move from number 6 to number 5 or number 4 to number 5. That's really the major changes we have. And to be quite honest, and I don't consider myself naive, I'm actually a little bit surprised that this actually very interesting list keep to be more or less the same throughout the years. And another conclusion that I've made looking at these lists throughout the years is there's a huge disconnect, and I mean a huge disconnect between what is deemed most important in a contract term and the terms that are most negotiated. So that actually means that there's a big conflict between what we really want, what we do find important, and what is actually being negotiated. And that is obviously a horror story, because if that is true, what I'm saying right now, we are wasting so much time negotiating variables, and a variable is what is negotiable. We are wasting so much time negotiating that, not generating any value for either of us. Now, obviously, I could have put up the whole list of all the terms, and that would have taken us forever. So this wouldn't be a 1-hour session, that would be a 5-day session. So I'm just taking the 10 first items up here. So that is the top 10 of the most negotiated terms. And the one you see in red is a waste of time. I hope I'm provoking somebody right now, but that is a waste of time. So when we look at something like scope and goals, responsibilities of the parties, price charge, price changes, limitation of liabilities, data protection, and change management, is all zero-sum variables. That means it doesn't generate any value for anybody. Now, listen, I'm not saying we shouldn't negotiate these items up here. I'm just saying they shouldn't be in the top 10. Perhaps they should be at the very end of the list, because yes, we should negotiate them, but they're not generating value. Now, I think you would agree with me, it is so much easier starting negotiating something that has a commercial interest that will generate a value to both parties, so we avoid zero-sum. And imagine we could actually generate necroeconomics. That means creating additional value for both parties without anyone is paying for that. I'm going to share with you throughout this session here how we're actually going to do that. Now, one of the challenging things we have, and I know that based on 3 different surveys done by 3 different organizations, we've done it ourselves, and 2 other organizations have studied trust. And as I said already, trust is actually at a lower level than ever recorded before. And that is very often the reason that we are wasting our time negotiating something that is not creating any value, because we just don't have the trust today. Now, I was reminding about that just a short time ago, because I started my career way back in what feels like 1876 in what was called rank Xerox then. And you probably all know Xerox, obviously they do copiers, but I was in the printing department, and we were selling huge units that was doing printing, volume printing for states, organizations, and banks and insurance companies and stuff like that. And the price of one of those units back then, when I started my career in Xerox, was about $200,000. And I'm not exaggerating my story. The contract we used to sell one of those units back then was 4 pages. That was it, done deal. Printer was sold. Everybody's happy. I was visiting Xerox a couple of years ago in another context, and I was actually asking them, could I have a look at the contract selling the same equipment? They're still selling those huge volume printers. And obviously technology has evolved, so it's way more advanced today. But you know what's funny enough? The price of the printer is still $200,000. And I was just asking, could I have a look at the contract that you use today to sell the same equipment that I was selling back in the late 80s? And they came with the contract to me. And again, as I said, I'm not exaggerating my story. What was 4 pages back when I did it has now developed into 7 binders. And I was asking them, how do you feel about the contract today? And everybody I talked to at Xerox said, you know what, we don't really get the contract. We don't understand the concept. We don't even understand what paragraph leads to what paragraph. And the strange thing is, our client don't either. And I'm just wondering, are we making the world more complicated because it's just fun? Shouldn't we actually wake up every morning thinking, how can I simplify the world? But how come even with more technology and more advanced opportunities today, we make collaboration way more complicated than it was 20, 25, 30 years ago? And one of my answers to that is back to what I said earlier. Trust is lower today, and if we have no trust, we have to hide behind paragraphs and contracts and attorneys and lawyers, and that means our transactional cost just goes up. Just before I move into discussing the concept of necroeconomics and why we should change the most negotiated terms and what should be at the top of the most negotiated terms, let me just dwell a second on The Wealth of Nations. That is a very, very famous book, written in 1700 by the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. And I know everybody that is online right now that has been studying economics in their life has been introduced to this book, because that is the Bible of the economical system in the West. That is the Bible of the capitalistic system. So we basically all believe in that, because that is really still what works in the world. Now, if you haven't read it, please don't, for 2 reasons. One, it is really a tough thing to go through. I mean, it is not only boring, it is hard to read, and it is something that will guarantee you to fall asleep at night. I can promise you that. The second thing, and the second reason I would advise you not to read that book, is because it's absolutely wrong. And that is scary, isn't it? I mean, especially if you've been studying economics, to be told that this book is absolutely wrong. Its approach into how we think economic and markets are absolutely wrong. Now, I am not the one that is claiming that. There was people way brighter than me and before me who were saying that, and one of them was the famous American Professor Nash. Some of you probably watched the movie A Beautiful Mind. If you haven't, please go home and do it immediately, because that is an excellent study in how to think differently, and how Adam Smith originally thinking was absolutely wrong. Because Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, the best result will always come from everyone in the group is doing what is best for themselves. Now, that is what Adam Smith said. That is really capitalism. So capitalism is based on pure egocentric behavior. We should only do what is best for ourselves. Dr. Nash, which by the way got the Nobel Prize in economics, actually said that is incomplete. That is absolutely wrong. What we should do instead is looking at it this way. The best result will always come from everyone in the group doing what is best for himself and the group at the same time. That is the only way we all can win. Ladies and gentlemen, this is necroeconomics, because yes, obviously we shouldn't be paying for somebody else's success, but we shouldn't either win at somebody else's expense. That is the zero-sum approach. And back to the most negotiated terms, most of them are based on zero-sum variables. And that means we can't all win. And I'm not saying that just because I think we should all be happy and sitting in a circle and singing songs and holding hands. I'm saying this because if we actually change our view of negotiation from zero-sum into partnership on economics utilizing values, not only will you be more successful, and it's not happening at the expense of the counterpart, but the counterpart will be more successful as well, instead of just hanging on to the zero-sum approach in negotiations. Do all of you know this guy up here, this gentleman? That is obviously an alien. Hopefully you haven't met him, because I think that would be a scary experience. But I have a very close colleague by the name of Dan Shapiro, who is a professor at Harvard University. And Dan is closely connected and a director of the program on negotiation. And Dan Shapiro has been at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland several times, and he had the opportunity of run this exercise. And this is part of the horror story, ladies and gentlemen, because please be ready. This is going to be a 2-minute story. What Dan Shapiro had was the opportunity to invite a huge group of world leaders and executives into a room. There was about 80 of them in the room. He divided them into groups, and then he said, ladies and gentlemen, you in your group have to agree in your group to point out a leader. And that leader have to negotiate with the leader of the other groups to pick one group to lead all of the groups, right? And you have 3 hours to reach an agreement which group is going to lead all of the groups in this room. And if you don't manage to do that within 3 hours, aliens will arrive on Earth and destroy all human lives, right? We had presidents, prime ministers in this room, executives of major corporations, and they had 3 hours to avoid the death of all human beings on the face of the globe. Here comes the horror story. Do you think they managed to reach an agreement within 3 hours? Anyone? No, they didn't. So the world was destroyed. We all died and nobody heard of it. Isn't that scary? Even though I know it's a simulation, it just shows human character. We have a really hard time negotiating, even our own best interest, because our egocentric behavior sometimes stops us. Because what happens in those groups, and I was an observer, was obviously that all of them are thinking, well, we are the best one. We should lead everybody else. So why should they lead? They're not better than us. And this guy over there, he's running a stupid country. So why should he lead? And, you know, we had all kind of weird arguments why this group should lead and not the other group should lead. That is basically the same reason that the most negotiated terms are looking as they are, because we are extremely selfish in our approach into negotiation. We have a tendency to think about our own risk, our own liabilities, our own cost, our own options, interest, values, profits, and so on. And sometimes we completely forget there's a counterpart sitting on the other side of the conference table with a body temperature, by the way, that is completely identical to your own, but they might have different values, interest, cost, liabilities, risk, and so on and so forth. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to focus more on the counterpart's values and cost than our own. Now, I'm involved in hundreds of real-life negotiations every year as an advisor, and I see this in 90% of all of them. When I sit down with the client and their attorneys, by the way, there's a tendency that they start talking about what is it we want to achieve, what is our potential, what is our risk, what is it we want to avoid. And when they've been doing that for about 20 minutes, I stop all of them and ask them the following question: what do you think the counterpart want? What do you think might be their value? What do you think might be their cost? So we go through the variables that we should negotiate on and prioritize the one where we find we can create a mutual value for everybody involved in this negotiation. Just to continue my horror story, and I don't want to make everybody depressed around the world, that's not the purpose, because there's a lot of good news, obviously. But let's just assume for a second that you and I are sitting watching two parties negotiating, right? Those two parties don't know if they can reach an agreement or not, but we know that because we're just sitting there observing them, and we actually have the cheat sheet, so we know it is possible for them to reach an agreement. Now, let's just assume it's a very simple negotiation. As you can see, it's a painting. The buyer want to buy this painting. I don't really know why, but the buyer want to buy this painting, and the seller want to sell this painting, right? As you can see in the circle, what we know is that the price of the painting is the following. The sales rep can't go below a price of $110,000, and the purchaser can't pay more than $123,000. Now, we only have two variables in this negotiation. One of them is price, and we can see there's actually room to negotiate, right? There's $13,000 up there. And the other variable is the painting itself. And they already agreed on that because the buyer want to buy and the seller want to sell, right? So how many of you believe that that will be 100%? That means everybody will reach an agreement. In theory, it should be 100%, right? Because we have room to negotiate. There's $13,000 up there to reach an agreement, and the buyer want to buy and the seller want to sell. So in theory, it should be 100%. It is not. the outcome of this study, and I've done this more than 3,000 times, is 90%. So that means 10% fails and don't reach an agreement. You know what's interesting? When I show this study here around the world, I actually meet people who tells me that is really good, isn't it? I mean, 90%, that's a big hit rate. And I'm usually responding by saying, no, that's terrible. Imagine a very simple negotiation like this. It hardly can get any more simple than that. And we have still 10% that actually fails big time. And when I'm talking about failing is obviously because they could have reached an agreement, but for whatever reason, they didn't. And what is even more scary is that they're going to leave the conference table, going back to their organization and tell the organization it wasn't possible to reach an agreement. Okay, let's complicate things just a tiny bit more, okay? Because now we move from this very simple negotiation of only two variables, the painting and the price, into something that is probably more identical to your typical daily life, right? In a typical negotiation, we have a number of variables, and I don't even have enough up here. There could be a lot more. Just look at the terms of most negotiated items, and there you go. That could be all the variables. So in this case, up here we have price, terms of payment, delivery time, cost of production, availability, installation, and maintenance. Once again, you and I are sitting watching the two parties negotiate, and we know that they can actually reach an agreement. We know that. They don't know that. Besides all these variables up here that you and I know they can actually reach an agreement on, we also know that they can reach an agreement on the price. And identical to the previous study, what we know is that the sales rep can't go below 11 million and the buyer can't go above 12.8. So obviously we have 1.8 as the traditional room for negotiation. So just repeating myself, we know that they can reach an agreement, they don't. Identical question as previously. What do you think is the percentage of these negotiations that will be successful? Do anybody think that it might be less than before? Because then you're absolutely right. The number now is down to 66. So 66% will reach an agreement. Do you know what's interesting, ladies and gentlemen? That means 34% is unsuccessful in a negotiation where they're supposed to be successful. And the scary thing in this case is they don't even know it. Just like the other group, they'll be leaving this negotiation, going back to their own organization and telling them it wasn't possible. There wasn't room to negotiate. We couldn't reach an agreement. So what I'm basically saying right now is that 34% of all negotiations that could be successful are basically not. And on top of that, we know that those negotiators who actually are successful, that means reaching an agreement, they typically only utilize 60% of the true potential in that negotiation. That is why it is a horror story. And that is why that the most negotiated terms is a horror story, because that is basically responsible for this outcome up here. Now, when I'm talking about a failed negotiation, what do I mean by that? Because obviously some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, a failed negotiation is when the parties couldn't reach an agreement, and that is absolutely true. But if I should just try and define very quickly what I see is a failed negotiation. A failed negotiation could be where the parties fail to find sufficient overlap in their interest and position to reach an agreement, even though such an overlap exists and a deal could and should have been reached. That is what I call a failed negotiation. Another way of defining a failed negotiation is the one I got here. So that means a party rejects a deal even though his or her counterpart's latest offer was better than his or her best alternative to deal with that party. In my world, that's a failed negotiation as well. And when we connect this to economics and smartmanship, then the third one becomes a failed negotiation as well. So that means the parties reached a deal, but the parties could have reached a mutually better deal without individual giving up anything. So the parties left some values on the table, and that value would be economics. If that happens, that is a failed negotiation as well. Now, we all know this gentleman up here, Professor Einstein, obviously, and he said imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, imagination encircles the world. What I see in very successful negotiators is they are actually creative. Not creative so they're thinking out of what is legal and bending the law. That's not what I'm saying. But they actually develop variables that will create value for the counterpart. I was sitting with a client just last week, a huge technology company with about 4,000 employees working globally. And this technology company, they were working typically on 20 to 30 variables when they were negotiating. We did a brainstorming, and in less than 1 hour, they actually came up with 220 variables. 220 variables. I'm not saying that all of them could carry a value. I'm not saying all of them should be implemented, but I can promise you that at least half of that would actually be suitable to be used to generate value in a negotiation. Now, let me just share with you what I'm talking about when I'm talking the choice of strategy. As I said already, we have zero sum, we have partnership, and we have partnership. In a zero sum, as I just mentioned, it's basically just look at the picture up here. You have a gentleman with boxing gloves on. We are fighting the counterpart. So as I said earlier, we are winning at the expense of the counterpart. So this is what we could call a one-win-lose situation in best case. And in some cases, it actually becomes a lose-lose situation. The alternative to zero sum would be partnership. And partnership is a very misunderstood word, because I often find organizations that are talking about partnership, but what they're really doing is long-term zero sum. Because some organizations, they actually think if we're doing zero sum, and we've been doing zero sum with our counterpart for the last 7 years, then we must be in a partnership. But that is not really a partnership. That is just a long-term zero sum. So a real partnership is where the parties are committed to finding a common solution to reduce cost and increase profit. So the progress for both parties is based on the creation of success for one without the loss of the other. So it's true acting as true. But however, in this case, we very often see limited disclosure and limited collaboration. Now, moving into partnership. In partnership, the parties have agreed a role of the engagement. So that basically means rules of the game. They're very conscious about the process on developing variables, as mentioned already. So they would never start with the items we have on the most negotiated terms. And they're very focused on generating added value. So that is necroeconomics. The negotiations is open, honest, and creative without being naive. And it's two parties working seamlessly together in what we call an informed cooperation. Back to my list. What we see here is obviously now highlighted the variables on the top 10 of the most negotiated terms that could generate necroeconomics. And that would be delivery, acceptance, service level, performance guarantees, undertakings, and payment. So out of the 10, we only have 4 that could potentially generate some values. And the scary thing, just to continue my horror story, is that those 4 we got up here are not even the variables that could generate the highest level of mutual value between the parties. That will be something completely different that we should have a look at. Now, when we look at the zero-sum game, we see cost and earnings. And I think we could all agree that we would all love the blue circle, we would all love the earnings, right? And nobody really want to take on cost. So if we look at the cost circle, we have risk, liability, and physical work, and a lot of other stuff, obviously. And if we look at the earnings, we have know-how, market, relations, and whatever. So everybody wants the earnings, nobody really wants the cost. And I don't know about you guys, but I've never stepped into a negotiation and seen the counterpart saying, you know what, I believe that your risk, liability, and physical work and cost are way too high. You shouldn't do that. I'll just give you another $1 million because that's not fair. That's not what's happening. Everybody sitting there want to increase their earnings and reduce their costs. If we change that and look into what I call smartnership instead, look what's happening right now. The circle of the profit will increase and the circle of the cost will be decreased, because we are now looking at on how can we increase the profit between us and how can we between us reduce the cost side. Let me share a real story just to kind of emphasize what I'm talking about when I'm talking about smartnership versus zero sum. This is a real life negotiation that happened a couple of months ago. And it was a negotiation that happened between a manufacturer of lids. As you can see, that's a lid you have right there for that box. And they were manufacturing lids for the food industry. And this manufacturer of lids had a huge client in the retail industry, a huge retail store. I'm not mentioning any names here, but they had an annual contract value of $25 million. And they've been working together for 6 years, and everybody was actually very happy until this happened. The buyer suddenly arrived at the meeting with the supplier and said, you know what, we want a price reduction of 9%. And 9% of the total annual contract value was obviously $2,250,000. So they just said, you know, they just were very blunt about the whole thing, that is what we want. And if we can't get that, we might pursue an alternative supplier. What you're witnessing right now is obviously a zero-sum game, right? Because the buyer just want a reduction, and that reduction has to be paid by the supplier. So if the buyer should be successful in this case, the counterpart will lose. On the other hand, if the supplier managed to negotiate the 9% out of the deal, that means the supplier would be successful and the buyer would be losing their expected reduction of 9%. Why the 1 to the 9% is not really important in this case right now. Now, instead of just heading straight into a zero-sum game and start arguing back and forth about terms of contract and how we've been doing business all this time and blah, 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 what could typically happen in a zero-sum, they actually agreed to start looking at this from a SmartNation point of view. So what they did was they sat down and then they looked at all the variables that could potentially carry some value in this deal. They looked at the whole value chain as it was agreed originally. And what they discovered was that on the delivery term, it was actually agreed in the existing contract that the supplier should deliver at 16 different locations twice a month. It was also agreed that the cost of warehouse should be kept by the supplier. So the supplier should be the one holding everything in their warehouse. It was agreed that terms of payment should be 65 days from delivery. It was agreed that the warranty period was 3 years. It was agreed that the lid size had a certain size and couldn't be changed. And it was agreed that all ordering should happen just in time. So there was no bulk planning, there was no long-term planning whatsoever. They actually discovered a few more variables, but these were the key variables. Now, when you have identified those key variables up here, obviously you have to sit down and look at cost and value on each of them. So what they actually figured out that if they could change the size of the lid, that would make a savings for one of the parties and a cost to the counterpart. They figured out that if you could change just in time to plan bulk, that would make a saving for one side and create a cost for the counterpart. If they change the warranty period from 3 to 1 year, that will give a cost to one side but create a savings to the counterpart. And if they move the warehousing from the supplier to the buyer, that would generate a cost to one side and a savings to the counterpart. Changing delivery from 16 locations to 1 and reducing from 2 delivery a month to 1 delivery a month would once again make a saving to one side and generate a cost to the counterpart. And the final one, changing terms of payment from 65 days to cash payment, at order, would also generate a value to one side and generate a cost to the counterpart. And here comes the fairy tale ending. This is almost like a Disney fairy tale, because utilizing the cost and values, the party together created a total amount of value in economics of 4,198,000. And you know what the wonderful part of this story is? This amount of money is free money because it's not generating a cost to one in order to create that. I don't want to drown you now in details in a spreadsheet, but this is the solution you got up here. So just taking one of them out of the context just to explain it to you. One of the variables we have was changing delivery from 16 locations to 1. As you can see, that would generate a savings to the supplier, obviously, because they only had to deliver to 1 location, where previously they had to deliver to 16 locations. That generated a savings to the supplier of 580,000. But obviously the customer had to do internal logistics change right now, and that will give them a cost of 140. But hey, here we go. The room for negotiation and the economic value would obviously be the difference between the two numbers up here. And the two parties identified, hey, by changing this variable, we would mutually generate a value of 440,000. If you just look through all the variables, I'm not going through all of them, you'll just see that is how we end up with 4,198,000. So each side is compensated for the cost they may take on in order to generate a profit to the counterpart. Let me ask all of you a question. Are you willing to take on an additional cost in a negotiation if that will utilize a benefit to the counterpart, and that benefit to the counterpart is bigger than your cost, and the counterpart is willing to compensate your cost? Hopefully the answer is going to be yes, because that is how we actually change the traditional way of looking into negotiation to a new and more advanced and better way to do it. If you look at this,
Keld, can I interject just, we've got some questions coming in, so rather than saving them all to the end, Mark Becker was asking, going back to question on scope and goals, he says, why wouldn't focusing on scope and goals up front not be an excellent example of smartnership? Why would not starting off on the same page and working towards the same goals not be smart? I don't see how agreeing on scope and goals is zero sum. I see it as a foundation for cooperation and collaboration. Could you explain that further?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. It's a great question. Thank you so much. Scope is obviously something that is important to negotiate. And let me just emphasize that again. When I'm saying that some of the terms of the most negotiated terms, some of the variables on that list, when I'm saying they are ridiculous, I don't mean it in a way that it shouldn't be negotiated. They should be negotiated, but we should prioritize differently. So back to the question about scope. Yes, scope is obviously important. The problem with scope is that very often scope is just what I want. That is the framework of the negotiation. And when I'm just explaining and arguing what I want, that is not necessarily creating a value to me or generating a cost to the counterpart at this point. So what I'm recommending is just prioritizing the variables that we believe will generate the highest values to both parties. Start off with them. Because it's actually a great question timing-wise, because if I could relate it to the slide I got on the screen right now, what we see very typically is that we have a buyer that has a budget, and that budget could be 150,000. And the budget could be controlled by what I call the next best alternative, or the budget. Now, on the other side, you see the sales rep, and the sales rep is sitting with a limitation. They can't go below a price of 120. So that is what we call the traditional room for negotiation, right? And that room for negotiation would obviously be 30,000. But that is not the real room for negotiation. The real room for negotiation is very often much, much bigger and consists of the traditional space, that is the 30,000, plus all the added value. And we know that could potentially be up to 42%. Back to the question about scope. If you actually feel that scope would create a value to one side and a cost to the counterpart, or perhaps even a value to the counterpart, obviously, yes, it should go in there and be prioritized as one of the top one and first one to negotiate. If we can't allocate, identify, or capitalize that as a value to one side and a cost to the counterpart, then it shouldn't be an opening variables that we should discuss. So it's basically down to the parties. As I said earlier, one of the 4 things we have to do before we actually head into negotiation is to negotiate on how to negotiate. So we have to negotiate what variables are we going to focus on. And back to the questions here, yes, if we do feel that scope can generate a mutual value, and value, I mean actually something that we can capitalize and put a certain value on from a currency point of view, then it should be negotiated in the beginning. If we can't do that, put it back in the back. Again, as I'm saying, it's not a question that we should negotiate it, which should not be prioritized as one of the top 10 or top 20 or top 30.
Brilliant, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Can I ask a question from Miguel? And Miguel has asked, how do you increase the trust in the negotiation process? Talking about trust between parties.
That is probably one of the best questions you could ever ask in this world today. and I would love to have the answer to that. And unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer, because I think we can all agree we don't step into a conference room, shake hands with the counterpart and said, we would love to have trust and openness, and the counterpart would agree to that, and boom, there we go, we have trust and openness. It's not working that way, really, is it? Trust is coming from actions. So it's not something we can verbalize. It comes from what we're doing. It comes from what we're proving that we believe in what we're saying. So it's from actions, is not what we have verbally agreed. Now, having said that, we actually often build in rules of the game that we talk about trust. So we actually open up negotiation talking about trust, and even verbalize what we mean by talking about trust. So we even talk about what happens if we feel that trust is decreased, what will we do, what is the action that is supposed to be followed up on, and so on and so forth. But trust is really a tricky thing, especially when we talk about moving from zero-sum into partnership, because the utilization of variables and creating economics will never happen without trust. Now, I'm not naive. I have to emphasize that once again. So I don't become naive in a negotiation. I don't advise my clients to become naive. So we should share information with the counterpart, but we should only do it when we're absolutely certain that the counterpart are playing the same game. That means we actually trust each other. So there's several ways of doing that. And I think there was a famous Soviet Union leader once that said, trust is good, but control is better, right? I don't necessarily agree with that term. What I'm just saying is that we need a certain level of control in the beginning. So I wouldn't start with a variable that would give us a tremendous amount of value and just throw that variable out there. I might start with something very low value orientated. And typically, for instance, in terms of payment, it's something that is easy to start with, believe it or not. I find that companies are happy to exchange their cost of capital way before they're willing to do something else. So I would start with a variable that contains less value. I would verbalize the importance of trust. I would talk about it. I would I would insert it as part of the rules of the game, and then I could add on. But it's a great question that really takes a lot longer to explain. So I apologize for the short version.
No, I can appreciate that. And if we can, we'll do one more question from David. Malpractice law focuses lawyers' attention on the most negotiated terms. If the lawyer fails to address those terms well, they're liable. He or she is liable, and it doesn't matter what he or she did a great job creating value on other terms. In other words, malpractice law doesn't take a holistic look at the lawyer's work, but just focuses on the cause at issue in the dispute, often one of the most negotiated terms. How do we address this issue?
I think that is a wonderful question as well, because I was actually just being made aware of that the other day. Obviously, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not looking at this from a legal point of view, and I'm very often working closely together with experts in the legal area. And it's a great concern, because obviously I fully understand that as an expert hired to advise a client, if you feel that you could be hit by, even if you have created enormous amount of success for your client, if you could actually be hit because you have not fulfilled some of the other items, I mean, that is certainly a dilemma. I truly understand. Since I'm not an attorney, I'm probably not the right one to give that advice, but it's certainly an item that should be raised, because that could be conflicting with what I'm talking about when I'm talking about addressing or readdressing the variables in order to create economics. My idea, though, would be just like I'm addressing it with my clients, I would actually, as an attorney, address this issue with the client and saying, my focus here today is actually helping you become as commercially successful as possible. So that means, obviously, I don't want to be hit in the back later on because we didn't negotiate that items or the other items. Now, back to what I've been repeating several times already. I'm not saying we shouldn't negotiate the terms I'm actually making fun of right now. I'm just saying we shouldn't negotiate them in the beginning, because if we start negotiating something that is zero sum, it's just difficult, because it's a win-lose situation. So start with variable generating value and then take up the other items later on.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other questions right now, Wendy?
Well, there was a comment that trust is something that ought to be built way before we go into the negotiating room.
That's a very good comment.
Somebody listen.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's a great comment. Yes. Yeah.
And then there was a comment from Tom, basically asking whether he heard you saying that Brexit was a failed negotiation, or you thought that. But perhaps we should leave Brexit to the end of this if we have time.
I think we could do a separate, a very separate talk on that. I'll be happy to make a few comments on that later on. But yes, okay, I just move on.
Perfect.
Yeah, he noticed the picture I got on the slide, and there's a reason for that. Anyway, what we got up here is the pie charts, and what we have discovered. I'm sure some of the audience here today have seen this one before from me, but what we have identified based on more than 35 negotiations we have studied globally is that, in general, if we take a typical negotiation that, let's say, has a value of $1 million, we see that the buyer on average is only getting 19% of the values, the supplier is getting 39% of the values. And what is interesting is these two sides actually don't know what they got in percentage of the total size of the pie. So the buyer could be very happy stepping away from this negotiation, not knowing they only got 19%, and not knowing that they could actually have generated a lot more. The supplier is very happy as well, even though he or she doesn't have any clue that they got 39%. That is not really the important thing about this pie chart. The important thing is the 42% unutilized that I call economics. So that means we have two parties that might have been sitting there negotiating, might have creating an outcome both of them are happy about, but they are leaving the 42% on the table. And neither of them sees it, identify, or capitalize that value. That is not happening if we follow the most negotiated terms. We are not going to create those 42% because we start in the wrong place. We start negotiating the variables that is not utilizing, focusing on that potential of economics. So what I've created is the strategy assessment metrics. And this one is actually assisting our clients in finding the right approach into a negotiation. It's very simple, really. If you look at the vertical line, what you see is what is important for your counterpart. How important are you for the counterpart? If you look at the horizontal line, that will explain how important the counterpart might be for you. So obviously, the more important the counterpart might be for you, the further you move to the right on the horizontal line, and the more important you might be to your counterpart, the more you move up on the vertical line. So obviously, if your counterpart feel you're very important for them, and you feel that the counterpart is very important for you, you will end up in the top right box where it says high impact, high risk. Question: what approach into negotiation should you be using when both parties find each other equally important for each other? Without any doubt, smartnership. Not utilizing smartnership up there is just what I would call utterly stupidity, because we are not utilizing the right strategy, we're not working together, we're not generating additional value. On the other hand, if you look to the low box to the left, low impact, low risk, that means that the parties are not important to each other. You don't consider the counterpart important to you, and the counterpart don't consider you important to them. Then we end up with that box, low impact, low risk. What strategy approach should you use then? Obviously, zero sum. So I'm not traveling the world explaining that everybody should be using smartnership. Absolutely not. I can find negotiation where zero sum would be the right strategy for several reasons. I can find a negotiation where partnership is the right approach. And obviously I can find negotiation where smartnership is the right approach. What is just a horror story for me is really a lot of negotiators haven't even been thinking this matrix through before they step into negotiation. They just do whatever comes to them. And that means sometimes they use zero sum or they should be using smartnership. And sometimes even they use smartnership or they should be using zero sum. So that's just a confusion about what strategy we should actually be using when we get into a negotiation. So back to the top list here. And as I said, I could go through the whole list, and I'll actually give that as a home assignment to our listeners here. Take a very critical look at all the typical items that you negotiate. And then think very hard, is this a commercial value to us that will give a cost to the counterpart? And that is absolutely fine, because that will still generate a value. Will this give a cost to us and a potential value to the counterpart? Then it's absolutely a variable that will create economics as well. Or could it even be a variable that will generate a value to us and the counterpart at the same time? Obviously, that is a commercial variables that we need to negotiate on. When you've been thinking through all the variables, then you should immediately prioritize those and push those at top. Because as I've been saying repeatedly, if we can create a mutual value, think back to my lit story a few minutes ago. If we can create a mutual value for both parties, that means that we can generate free money that is just lying on the table, the 42%. The remaining negotiation will become so much easier because we started off in a very, very positive atmosphere. I am going to Greenland once in a while. You know, Greenland is a cold place. I got inspired up there because obviously they have a lot of icebergs. So I renamed that into a iceberg, because what we typically see is that in a typical zero sum negotiation, we only see the top of the iceberg. So that's the visible part, right? You know, the iceberg, majority of the iceberg, 90%, is below surface. So in a zero sum, we only see a few variables, like the most negotiated terms. That is the variables we typically see in zero sum, because we're not working together, we're not generating collaboration. But if we're moving into something else than zero sum, we go into the invisible area. So that's below surface. And below surface, obviously, is the majority of the value. So that could be all the list of the variables we have here, or a lot of other variables that could potentially generate a true value for both parties. So if you just look at this measurement of temperature here, I would not rule out that you can be very successful in zero sum. I see major corporations around the world that are conducting zero sum, and I can't rule out that they are very successful in their negotiation. Obviously, I could always argue, could they become even more successful if they change their behavior from zero sum into partnership, or could they even become even more successful if they actually moved into smartnership? But back to the matrix, obviously, we shouldn't always pick smartnership or zero sum. It's all down to really how we perceive the best approach into negotiation. So I just want to wrap up before we take some comments and questions by saying that utilization of economics is a requirement to optimize any transaction. And we actually do assessment on negotiators in organizations as well. And we qualify them as not qualified, qualified, or very qualified. And I can only say we only qualify our negotiator if they actually work with utilizing the potential of economics, because that makes their organization more successful, but not at the cost of the counterpart. And at the same time, back to Professor Nash, we help the counterpart become more successful, but not at the cost of our own situation. So that was basically my 2 cents today on why the most negotiated terms is a horror story, Wendy.
Well, thank you so much, Keld. It's been a very interesting session that we've been having. There are, I have another question here, a few more to go, as we have 4 minutes. If only the negotiations had a final say in what should be considered in the top 10, I have only had that possibility as an external advisor, not as an employee in procurement, exclamation mark. That's from Anya.
Another wonderful question. Thank you so much. I completely understand that. What is happening in real life is I meet a lot of my clients who obviously comes to me and said, I got the whole concept, you know, it's not really complicated. I agree with all of it, but the problem is that's not what I'm being measured on, or that's not what I'm ordered to do. And we can all agree that you and I as human beings, we have a tendency to do what we're being measured on, right? So if we're being measured on certain things, that is what we're going to negotiate on. If we have an organization that is just measuring, a procurement department, just measuring on how can we deduct prices, how can we get better prices than we got last year, then we are in trouble. Because obviously we will never focus on generating additional value in macroeconomics. So what can we do about that? Well, I have a tough challenge for those who are sitting in that position, and that is you should not only negotiate with your counterpart, you have to negotiate with your internal clients. So when you're sitting in procurement and somebody comes to you and say, we want to change delivery time from 2 weeks to 1 week, you just shouldn't go, okay, then that's fine. I will negotiate that with our supplier. You just start negotiating internally by asking, what value would that give us? And if the internal client can't explain to you what the value would be for us as an organization, you should just decline doing it, because then it's just stupid. If we don't internally actually understand what would be the value of changing a term, because obviously it will probably generate a cost to the counterpart, then we shouldn't embark on that road to that, what I would call typical zero-sum negotiation. So I meet a lot of extremely qualified, good, excellent negotiators in procurement, but I also meet some who are basically just a doll that is being directed what they should do. And you should challenge your organization, not because you just want to be a rebel, but because your organization could become way more successful by changing their view. Now, you all know the phrase, the water running downwards, right? So obviously you have to start at a high level. And I can promise all of you that if we go into the C level, the suite level of an organization, they'll get it, and they'll get it very quickly. And what I typically see is then they change the concept of how we should negotiate. But it's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, because it's very relevant for a lot of organizations worldwide.
And with a final comment there, we have that stubbornness internal to the organization is often the biggest issue that they face. Yes, I can really only say yes. Yes, exactly.
Once again, I mean, if we are not changing the mindset of how we negotiate, we are not going to get different outcomes. Isn't it weird? I mean, if we continue doing what we've always done, how is it that one goes? We always get what we always got, right? So we definitely need to change the focus, and that is my purpose. That is really trying to change that mindset on how we actually perceive negotiation, because it is perceived in a very wrong way, and that is why the most negotiated terms is prioritized completely wrong.
Well, thank you so much, Keld. It's been really interesting and just very informative session this afternoon. Appreciate your time in joining us on the webinar. On behalf of IACCM, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Feel free to contact me at wlawson@IACCM if you've got any questions. And we look forward to seeing you at another webinar. Thank you again, Keld, and really have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.